Blessings, good evening to you all. Tonight is Tuesday night, so we have a few questions that need answering. So we'll do our best. First one is, my life seems to get on top of me and I forget the Buddha's teachings. Can you recommend anything to help? Well, one of the ways they translate the word sati, not just mindfulness, but they also translate it as not forgetting or non-forgetting. So if you listen to the Buddha's teachings often with mindfulness, then some of the words and the meaning will stick in your mind, won't it? And then if you're mindful when you listen, then later on you can recall or remember the teachings. So the more mindfulness we practice, the less we'll forget what the Buddha said on every level. So part of our practice is bringing out mindfulness, clear comprehension in daily life, and then applying the Dhamma that is suitable or appropriate for each situation. So that could be the Dhamma or the practice of generosity, so remembering to cultivate generosity when we may be tempted to be stingy or selfish, remembering to be restrained and in our precepts. So actually remembering the precepts in a situation where you're tempted to break them. And we can all remember them if I ask somebody who's practiced Buddhism for a while what the 5 precepts are, or even maybe what the 8 precepts are. They can probably remember them and tell me. But the important thing is remembering them in the course of our day when situations come up that tempt us to break them. Do you still remember them? So like now it's becoming summer, even though the weather is cold. In the summer you have more flies, mosquitoes and other bugs around. Do you remember to keep the precept of not killing in daily life? So not forgetting the precepts. For example, when you're speaking, do you remember not to lie, not to insult others, not to use malicious speech? So remembering the precepts is appropriate through our day. Say, when you're sitting here meditating or listening to Dhamma, then it's quite easy to keep the precepts, but there'll be situations which test us and we might forget the precepts. So in those situations, the precepts are the Dhamma that we must remember, or the words of the Buddha that we must remember. And then of course, at moments when suffering arises, stress arises, trying to remember the Dhamma that we've heard that might apply in that situation. So if you're getting angry, irritated in a situation, to turn to the Dhamma is to turn to finding a way to cultivate tolerance, mindfulness obviously, and then tolerance or kindness, compassion for yourself, compassion for another person, even somebody who's annoyed you or hurt you. When you're getting angry with them, to cultivate compassion. This is the challenge of the practice, to remember to do that. Remembering your meditation object from time to time. And many people find this beneficial for their practice, to remember say their main meditation object may be the breath. So to keep coming back to the breath through the day. You may only sit meditation in a formal way once a day or twice a day. But to come back to the breath even for a minute or 2 minutes when you've got a few moments free in the middle of your day, that can be a very effective way to bring out mindfulness, bring you back to the Dhamma, remember the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. Same with chanting. This is one reason why people chant regularly, because it brings them back to remember the Dhamma, remember the Buddha, remember the teachings, and brings up very wholesome states of mind, such as the reverence for the Buddha, the recollection of the qualities of the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, recollection of the teachings, such as impermanence. When you recite verses that bring the Dhamma to mind, and then you can use it to teach yourself to let go of some stress, maybe to accept that something that's happened is just teaching you the impermanence of life. When things don't go your way, you don't get what you want, it's impermanent, not sure, and so on. So we have to use the Dhamma teachings, and as you use them, you remember them, you bring them up, and then you get better at using them, so they'll stick in your mind and you remember them better and they'll become more a part of your life. So what you're aiming to do is to make everything in your life part of the practice. Whether you're working, relaxing, you're on your own, you're with others, you're meditating, you're walking along the road, you're driving your car, you're doing this, doing that. It all can become part of the practice, and that brings your mind closer to the Dhamma, to the Buddha. But as you've pointed out, we forget the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, we forget the practice, we forget our meditation object, we forget the precepts, we forget things. We get intoxicated with life, and particularly our moods and our states of mind. So once you've recognized that problem, then you're looking for ways to lift your mind out of those times when you're intoxicated with something or lost in a mood, when you're depressed, sad, angry, worried, when you have strong desire overwhelming your mind. These are the times you try to use the Dhamma to help you become more mindful and pull you out of those states. So listening to the Dhamma regularly, associating with Kalyana Mitta helps, fellow practitioners, so visiting monasteries, temples, Buddhist centers regularly can help also. Using technology to read the Dhamma or listen to the Dhamma. So even though your mind might turn away from the Dhamma sometimes, trying to introduce skillful means in your life to bring it back to the Dhamma. And if you know the Dhamma, the teachings of the Buddha help you, they've helped you before, they've given you some meaning in life, some guidance, then to keep coming back to it even when you feel bored with it or fed up, still come back to the Dhamma and it will help you. So whether it's actually people who practice the Dhamma or books or talks, anything that brings you back to the Dhamma can help get you through those periods when your mind is turning away from it. And maybe another one, the Buddha said to make people heedful, recollect or remember that we're going to die one day. We're not here forever. Life is short. We don't know how much time we've got left in our life. So our time is precious. And if you have faith in the Buddha and his teachings, then the most valuable thing to do with your time is practice this path that the Buddha gave us. So you make it central to your life, and you keep reminding yourself that you still have to practice, you still have suffering coming up from time to time, so you still have to practice. And you're not going to be here forever, so you have to continue practicing while you can. Another question. The meaning of Therigatha is to call a bhikkhuni after she attains arahantship, or just a term for a senior nun? Well, from the Pali language of the Buddha, Theri does refer to a senior nun or bhikkhuni, a Theri, as opposed to a Thera, which refers to a bhikkhu, a monk. Gatha means like a verse. So we have one part of the Tripitaka, Khuddaka Nikaya, you have the Therigatha and the Therigatha, which are like verses or sometimes poems from senior elders, monks and nuns from the time of the Buddha. Now, they're usually considered to be enlightened. So usually anyone who becomes enlightened they call a Thera, even if they are only quite junior. In terms of the monastic discipline, the word Thera or Theri usually means somebody who's achieved 10 reigns, 10 years as a monk or a nun, upwards, called a Thera. So it's refers to the length of time they've been in the robes, but can even refer, if someone's enlightened after just 1 year, they can call them a Thera. It's like an honorary title because they've become enlightened. So the Buddha would even mention that a little novice who becomes enlightened, a novice boy who's become enlightened after not very long, you can call him a Thera if you want, for example, just to give him that honorary title because he's enlightened. But the enlightened bhikkhus and bhikkhunis in the time of the Buddha would utter verses of just describing the marvels of the Dhamma or the practice that they've done and their state of mind. They might explain it with poetry or exclaim a point of Dhamma. And so some of these were recorded and we get these verses from the Theras and Theris. And they can be quite inspiring. So if you like poetry, Buddhist poetry, you can read them from the Tripitaka. Another question. Nimitas not only refers to visual signs, but it can also refer to the feelings when the citta is spacious and warm. There's a question mark there, so I guess it should say, do nimitas refer to feelings when the citta, the mind, is spacious and warm? So this word nimitta is often translated as sign or the characteristic of something, and can refer to a number of different things. There's traditionally in the development of the mind in samadhi and meditation, they talk about the barikamma nimitta, the sign of the object of your meditation that comes up, that you keep focusing your mind on. So it could be the sensation of the breath in anapanasati, or it could be a word, or it could be a colour. One is doing a kasina, it could be a part of the body, one is visualizing or reciting the name of that part of the body and visualizing it. So it can, most often in this sense it's a visual thing, but not always. It can be a sensation too with the breath, or it could be visual. And one keeps putting the mind on that, and then that nimitta becomes more firm and stable, and then they call it Ukaha nimitta, and the sign that becomes more stable, and one learns from that, and then it becomes even more stable and you might say under your control, becomes patipaka nimitta. They call that the counterpart sign. So it's an image that can be compared to the real thing. So particularly useful for body contemplation. One develops a really clear image of the body or a part of the body or the body as a corpse. And if that image is so clear that one can see it with one's eyes open and it's very stable, one can use that to develop deep states of stillness, samadhi, jhana. That's patipaka nimitta. But then nimitta can also refer to just a sight or a sound, or a smell or a taste that arises. Usually it refers to when the mind is peaceful in samadhi, but not in one-pointed stillness where no sensations arise other than one is aware of the mind itself, focused on its object. But say one is experiencing what we call upajjhara samadhi, one can still have sensual impressions, sense impressions arising, so one might see a visual image. Could be an image of a person or a place or something. So that would be a visual nimitta, a visual sign. Or it could be a sound or so on. Or when people dream, they call that subin nimitta. When you have a dream, a very profound or memorable dream, you're waking up or you're falling asleep, you have this very profound dream that may seem to have some meaning for you, and they call that a form of nimitta. Can also have a nimitta that displays the characteristics of something. So it could be displaying the impermanence of something. So one could have an image of a person or a tree being very old, or to display impermanence, the aging of something. So like some people in the time of the Buddha, they'd be meditating, they have an image of themselves as an old person, or they were fixated on some other person, a male or female person that they were falling in love with or very obsessed with, and then they'd have a nimitta of that person being very old or aging before their eyes. So it's the sign of impermanence. That can be a nimitta. It can be a nimitta of the sign of dukkha, the characteristic of dukkha, some form of pain, suffering inherent in some object that the mind has brought up. Or it could be a nimitta of anatta, emptiness, for example. One of the ways they describe nibbana is animitta, signless, without character, without form. Because nibbana is emptiness. So it's the opposite of nimitta. And of course, nimittas can be something that we cling to, become obsessed by, confused by, attached to. So we have to be careful as we're practicing, if we have bright light nimittas, and to be careful not to get lost in them. Maintain mindfulness and also maintain awareness of the impermanent lack of nature and the lack of self in whatever nimitta arises. As far as when the citta is spacious and warm, I guess you're referring to a state of peace, like samadhi or stillness. So feelings, well, I'm not sure that they would call a feeling a nimitta. I mean, feeling is feeling. It could be a very pleasant feeling that arises with samadhi. And usually that's something that accompanies the mind. So not normally speaking, you wouldn't call that a nimitta, but there may be instances people can describe feelings as nimittas. Pleasant, neutral, unpleasant. But they may accompany an experience. So you may have a visual image and a feeling arises with that. So maybe you have a very frightening image arise. That the image may be called a nimitta, but then the feeling that accompanies it may be unpleasant. One's afraid, or it's an uncomfortable feeling, or it may be a very pleasant feeling when one sees something beautiful or very wholesome. It can be a very pleasant feeling accompanying that nimitta, that experience. So, for example, very common one is people go to Ajahn Chah's Chedi in Thailand, where his relics are, his bone relics. It's a place of worship, veneration, and a lot of people meditate there, chant there, circumambulate. So there's a very good, positive feeling. So some people will become very peaceful very quickly there, and their mind is quite sensitive. And then they'll have a nimitta, and they may have a very fragrant smell arise, like the smell of joss sticks or flowers, heavenly smell, just briefly or even for a while. You'd call that a nimitta, and then they have it's accompanied by a great sense of joy, what we call piti and sukha, happiness. So a happy, pleasant feeling arises accompanying the nimitta. And that's quite a common experience. Many people have had that. Another question. I feel uncomfortable seeing some lay practitioners charging big money by hosting a meditation retreat, when senior ajahns always offer the Dhamma for free. How can those lay teachers be so outrageous? Well, that's why monks are poor, isn't it? We can't charge fees for what we teach. We give teachings as a kind of gift back to the laity because they feed us and support us. And for the good of people everywhere, the religion, monks will teach, nuns will teach. But we don't handle money. Our rules are that we don't handle money, so then we don't charge a fee. So yes, Sangha will offer their services, advice, Dhamma teachings and so on, free. Lay people there, you could say, living on a different level or a different, live different level, in the sense nobody supports them and they have to earn a living. So it's become a common practice for lay practitioners to maybe offer to give retreats, teachings, write books, give talks and charge a fee. Not all, there's a few who do it for dana, but they're probably the minority. The majority need food, accommodation, clothing, pay certain bills, so then they can teach and ask for money. So one understands why they do that. Whether it's pure or not, well, that depends on the individual, doesn't it? What their state of mind is underlying their action. Whether they're attaching to the money they charge, the fee they charge, and the money they gain, whether there's any possessiveness, stinginess, greed involved. That's the danger with money, is that it tends to stimulate attachment. And then, of course, the other thing, how do you decide on fees and price of Dhamma? The Dhamma really is priceless, but people will have to decide on fees, so then there's opportunity for greed to slip in, I guess. I guess it's something you have to consider for yourself as a practitioner. If you go on a retreat, you pay for it, does it diminish from the quality of the Dhamma? Or maybe that Dhamma teacher still teaches quite well and has good things to say and there's a good feeling. It's something you have to consider for yourself, what's helpful for your practice. I've always found the Dhamma of teachers such as Ajahn Chah and his disciples, and then many other monks and nuns, good enough, and that is offered free, so you can follow them, go and stay in monasteries and practice for free, go on their retreats. I mean, nowadays there's so much free Dhamma offered, books free, online retreats and talks free. This very Q&A session is free. Sometimes in the world, though, people look at it differently, don't they? They say if something's free, it's not going to be worth very much, so they're not interested. They actually take more interest if a fee is charged. If there's a price put on it, it must be worth something. That's a more worldly way of thinking, isn't it? And yet that's often how people do treat things. You know, Dhamma books, if it's given away free, then I can just put it down. I don't have to read it, I don't have to treat it with respect, because it's just free. Dhamma talks on YouTube are free from Sangha members and things. So you turn it on, turn it off as you want. So maybe even free Dhamma it can lead you into an unskillful state of mind. Maybe you don't treat it with respect. So in the end, you've got to look at your own state of mind. How do you treat the Dhamma? How do you look at it? Do you value it? Do you respect it? Do you make it something central to your life? So if you think about it, Dhamma is like medicine for the mind. And so if you're ill in the mind, meaning you've got mental defilements that are causing you stress and you want to be free from that illness, then the Dhamma is something very precious. So we should always treat the Dhamma with respect and see it as something very valuable because it's getting us out of suffering. In the end, you can't put a money price on that, can you? So I'm not sure there's a real answer here, but each individual has to know them for themselves and practice accordingly. But we are practicing to abandon attachment, so just be wary that money and money matters do stimulate a lot of attachment, and that leads on to suffering. Another question, I feel uncomfortable. No, we've had that one. Next one, what can we do to still all mental formations? We can practice the Noble Eightfold Path, cultivate it, and bring it to completion. We can practice with heedfulness. That's the last teaching of the Buddha, isn't it? All conditions are impermanent, strive on with heedfulness. Because in conditions or formations are impermanent, they're not still. They're constantly arising, passing away, degenerating, they're dukkha. So the Buddha said, strive on with heedfulness. If you look at heedfulness, what is heedfulness? Well, it's bringing the Four Noble Truths to realization. Realizing the Four Noble Truths is being heedful. So understanding dukkha, abandoning the cause of dukkha, craving and attachment, cultivating the path to the end of dukkha, the Noble Eightfold Path, and then realizing the cessation of dukkha, nirodha or nibbana. This is the practice of heedfulness, and this is what will still mental formations. When we're not heedful and we're not cultivating the path, our mind is falling into agitation and dukkha all the time, whether we realize it or not. Sometimes we don't even realize it, do we? But as you practice heedfulness and cultivate the path, you become more mindful and aware and more reflective. You'll notice the stress, the suffering in your mind. Then you may gain that strong urge to want to still formations, because you see the suffering of endless mental formations, karmic formations forming, bringing their result. The pain, the suffering that it brings over and over again. You'll see that, and then you'll want to still the whole process or end the whole process. And that's nibbana. So the more you practice, the more you focus on nibbana. The more you want nibbana. But be careful, because even the wanting and the desire for Nibbana can agitate the mind and become another mental formation that is still a cause of suffering. So you have to practice for Nibbana without wanting it, which is what somebody once asked Ajahn Chah, and he said, yeah, that's right. You practice for it, but you don't want it. So it seems like a contradiction, but it's one of those subtle points in the Dhamma. You get to know the difference between skillful desire, which leads you to practice, but actually is leading to the mind quietening down more and more. It stills the mind. And unskillful desire, which agitates the mind, leads to more suffering. So you have to look at the quality of your desires affecting you as you practice, because the unskillful desires slip in all the time. I want peace, I want samadhi, I want understanding and knowledge, I want this, I want nibbana, I want the end of suffering. But that wanting can agitate the mind, it's not still. Whereas when one has right view, mindfulness is there, it leads on to the skillful activity of developing, cultivating sila, samadhi, panya, but without unskillful desires there. It just leads on to the action, putting effort into the practice, and then letting go. So the more you practice, the more you let go, the stiller, the quieter the mind becomes. You notice when you practice mindfulness, say, bring mindfulness to the breath, why do you start after time, maybe, or maybe very quickly if you're skilled at it and your samadhi is strong, but even if you're not skilled at it, over time practicing, your mind starts to settle down and become still, because you're letting go of all the craving and attachment, what we call the hindrances, at least temporarily. So you're getting an insight into the stilling of formations, and you appreciate it's good, it's pleasant, it's peaceful, it's another kind of deeper, more profound kind of happiness, the stilling of the mind. When you meditate and develop stronger samadhi, then your mind is not so agitated, it's not caught up into all these mental formations, the moods, the worries, the desires. So you can see that, and then your mind will incline more and more to practice, develop more mindfulness. But even just in one moment, when you're mindful, formations start to still, quieten down, don't they? We call it like putting a brake, having a good brake on your car, and you apply the brakes, the car slows down and comes to a stop. When you apply mindfulness over and over again, the agitation of mental formations start to slow down, come to a stop. So we call samadhi stillness. It's not yet nibbana, but it's a taste of nibbana, because it's giving you a taste of stillness. So keep doing that, and then your mind will incline more and more to that, letting go of the agitation of mental formations, and that desire to keep doing things. Another question: is it against the Vinaya when a bhikkhu agrees that a hunter can hunt inside the monastery? Yes and no. I mean, on the highest level, a monastery is a place of no self. Nobody owns it. It's just land. So there's been plenty of situations over the centuries when a monk has been in some bit of forest that may be designated or called a monastery, but it's a forest or country area, and then some hunter comes in hunting around, and the monk just carries on equanimously, mindfully meditating, and doesn't get involved with the hunter. It's happened many times. And the hunter may or may not kill something, and off he goes. It's not that the monk is agreeing with the hunter or encouraging the hunter. is simply practicing equanimity, perhaps for good reason. For example, I've been with a monk in a forest, deep forest, but it was a monastery, a big forest monastery, and a hunter came along with a very powerful rifle full of bullets. And the other monk said, "Oh, you can't hunt here. This is a monastery. You can't shoot the animals." And the man said, "This gun is not for shooting animals, it's for shooting monks." So in that situation, what do? You're not agreeing for the man to hunt, you're just accepting he's got a gun and you haven't, so you just let him do what he's going to do. And you tell the animals that you meet, "Get out of here quick, because there's a guy with a gun around." I'm being a bit flippant, but that was a true story. There's some situations you can do something, so maybe if the person is willing to listen, you can say, "Yeah, no hunting here," and you put up signs and you say, "Don't hunt." And in other situations, there's nothing you can do, you just have to let them get on with it, and because they're armed and they're maybe not going to listen to you anyway. So it just depends on the place, the situation. It's not necessarily agreeing with them if you just let them do it. Maybe there are these other factors involved as well. But of course, if the monk mentally agrees, consents to the hunting, then that's not a very wholesome mind state. That's maybe they don't like a certain animal in the monastery, and they think, "Oh, this hunter might get rid of it for me." So there's consent, there's a certain agreement, and that's definitely an unwholesome state of mind. So it does come up because we live in forests and country areas that monks can come across hunters, or hunters come across monks, and you just do the best to educate them and encourage them to respect the place, that it's a place, we say a monastery is a place of abhaya dana, the dana of giving fearlessness, abhaya, so safety, security is given to all beings, and that's humans and animals in a monastery. We practice the first precept. So if a person comes in who's a hunter, you encourage them to respect that and also keep the first precept while they're in the monastery. But sometimes you can achieve that, sometimes you can't. The world is like that. You can't always control other people and what they're going to do. Another question: are the asavas and avijja the origin of suffering? The simple answer is yes. Asavas mean the outflows, toxic outflows, we call them the mental fermentations, pollutants. The three asavas, well, the asava of ignorance, so avijja asava, becoming, bhavasava, and sensuality, kama asava. So avijja and asava are more or less synonymous, except for avijja is just one title that covers all mental defilements. They all originate in avijja, not knowing, or not being aware, lack of knowledge of the Four Noble Truths. Vicca means knowledge, avijja means without knowledge. So when the mind has no knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, mental defilements or asava will be conditioning it and taking over the mind and leading on to unskillful mental states, unskillful views, actions, attachments, craving, clinging, and so on. So there's many different words the Buddha used for mental defilements, the origin of suffering, they come from defilements. There's the 10 fetters, samyojana, and these are used partly to help us to see the development of the mind as one practices the Buddhist path, cultivates the Noble Eightfold Path. one progressively abandons the 10 fetters. So the first stage of enlightenment, the Sotapanna, the stream enterer, has abandoned the first 3 fetters: personality view, skeptical doubt, and the attachment to rites, rituals, external practices. And they're all coming from avijja, wrong understanding of things, lack of awareness, but they're abandoned. So some avijja is abandoned when one attains the first level of enlightenment. One still has attachment to sensuality because one still has a certain amount of greed, desire for sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. And where there's desire for sense objects, there'll also be aversion, because when you don't get what you want, you have desire. You fall into, when you don't get what you want or you lose what you want, you get irritated or averse. So sensual desire and aversion tend to come together. So as one practices more, the fetter of sensual desire and aversion are weakened, and then one attains the second level of enlightenment, what we call Sakatagami, once returner. And then as one practices cultivating the path, refining the practice of sila, samadhi, panya, then finally sensual desire and aversion, ill will are abandoned completely, and one attains the state, the third level of enlightenment, the anagami, the non-returner. So that's 5 of the fetters have gone for the non-returner. So that's 5 kinds of ignorance. There's still ignorance there, but some aspects of ignorance have gone. So this clarity, deep clarity, profound insight into the Four Noble Truths, but it's not yet complete. But the attachment to sensuality is gone for the non-returner, the anagami. So Gama asava, the asava of sensual desire, has gone. So one of the asavas has gone. But then there's still the asava of becoming. It's just it becomes more subtle. So the anagami still has to be contemplating the desire for continued existence in the realms of, we say, the fine material realm, the rupa realm, rupa bhava, and then arupa realm, the formless realm. These are based on the states of samadhi, the rupa jhanas, arupa jhanas. One can still get attached to them, want to have existence in those realms, to continue living in those realms endlessly, because they're very pleasant. But that's an attachment, isn't it? A very subtle one, but nevertheless it's an attachment. So the anagami is contemplating that, and they're also contemplating the final roots of all avijja, which is ignorance in all its forms, but also conceit, mana, and uttacca, restlessness of mind. These are manifestations of avijja. So bhava asava, bhava, the asava of becoming, and the asava of avijja are only abandoned by the arahant when the 5 more refined fetters are abandoned. Well, these 10 fetters, they're giving you a kind of a map, roadmap of the cultivation of the path leading to enlightenment, what's abandoned at what time for who, as it were. But asava is just one word for defilement. We've got the samyojana, the fetters, we've got the anusaya, the latent tendencies, we've got a few different words the Buddha used. But they're all rooted in ignorance. The starting point is unawareness of the Four Noble Truths. And that's why we emphasize the Four Noble Truths so much in the teaching. Teachings all revolve around and explain and come back to the Four Noble Truths, because that's what counters ignorance in all its forms. It's the medicine for ignorance. So that medicine you don't want to ignore or put on the shelf and not take. Don't put the Four Noble Truths on the shelf, use them, contemplate them, develop understanding of them every day. take that medicine and then you'll be free from the illness of suffering. Last question. Samatha practice can lead to jhana, form, kamaloka, to rupa loka, the fine material world, and then arupa loka, the immaterial world, and then finally reach the end of the asava. Is this the right sequence? Oh, this is sort of linked to the last question. Well, yes, but samatha refers to the training of the mind in tranquility, developing samadhi, which, as you say, progressively deepens. The more you train in it, the further you develop it. So one develops the 4 rupa jhanas, the fine material jhanas that if one hasn't become enlightened when one dies, one might be reborn in that realm. And then the arupa jhanas, the formless jhanas, and if one hasn't reached nibbana, one might be reborn in the arupa realm. But what leads to nibbana is insight into the 3 characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and the selfless nature of phenomena. Even these very refined states of jhana are anicca, dukkha, anatta. So this is, as I was just saying, the anagami is still contemplating this attachment or identification and attachment to states of the rupa jhanas, the arupa jhanas. There can still be some clinging, some delusion there. So one has to continue to observe them as impermanent, as not self, to abandon this, what we call bhava, the desire for existence in those realms. You know, the very attachment to jhana, one has to abandon. So the arahant has abandoned that. No more attachment even to the bliss of jhana, no more wish to just be living in a nice Brahma realm forever and ever, even though you don't live forever and ever, but the feeling that you would live forever and ever, because Brahmas live for a long time. They've abandoned that. No more desire for any form of existence in that normal way. So I guess you could say, yes, you've described the right sequence, but samatha has to be practiced with vipassana. Even these very refined states of samadhi, one has to see them as not self and abandon any clinging to them. So, that's tonight's questions. We'll leave it there and wish you all well with your practice. Don't give up, keep going, and if you forget the Dhamma in daily life, just listen to more Dhamma teachings, bring yourself back to the path.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.